It was never my intention to step inside his house. And yet, that day changed everything. What began as a simple act of concern unraveled into something I could never have anticipated. My husband was away on another business trip, leaving me to face yet another quiet, solitary day at home. To keep myself occupied, I threw my energy into cleaning, dusting shelves, reorganizing drawers, and mindlessly scrolling through social media. The monotony of it all clung to me like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing hour. It was around noon when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a sound easily lost in the hum of daily life. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, a persistent rush of water coming from Richard's house next door. Initially, I thought little of it. Perhaps his plumbing was acting up, or maybe he'd left a tap running. But the sound didn't stop, and unease began to creep in. Richard, my neighbor, was a man of quiet dignity. He'd lived alone since his wife's passing a few years back. While we weren't particularly close, there was something reassuring about his presence, his meticulously maintained yard, his polite greetings whenever we crossed paths. He carried himself with a steadiness that seemed unshakable, even in the face of loss. But the thought of him alone in that house, with the water running unchecked, gnawed at me. What if something had happened to him? What if he needed help? I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was overreacting. But then, as I glanced out the window, I saw it. His front door was ajar. A chill ran down my spine. That wasn't like Richard. He was meticulous, the kind of person who double-checked everything. Something was wrong. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding. Then, unable to ignore the knot of worry tightening in my chest, I stepped outside and made my way to his door. As I stood there, nerves prickling under my skin, I knocked lightly. "Richard? Are you all right?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. The sound of rushing water from inside the house only grew louder. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. My mind raced through worst-case scenarios. What if he'd fallen? What if he was unconscious and couldn't call for help? Finally, I took a deep breath and pushed the door open a little wider. "Richard?" I called again, stepping into the entryway. The living room was immaculate, just as I'd expected. Everything was in its place, and the faint scent of aftershave lingered in the air. But the sound of running water drew me further inside, toward the hallway. My heart raced as I approached the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. Steam wafted into the hallway, carrying with it the unmistakable humidity of a running shower. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But concern overruled my better judgment. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside, and froze. Through the fogged glass of the shower door, I saw him. Richard stood under the stream of water, his back turned, shoulders broad and glistening as the water cascaded over him. My breath caught in my throat. I realized, with mounting horror, that I had intruded on something deeply personal. Before I could retreat, he turned slightly, catching sight of me in the doorway. His eyes widened, but his expression wasn't what I expected. There was no anger, no embarrassment. Instead, he looked calm, composed. I'm so sorry," I stammered, quickly averting my eyes. My face burned with mortification. "I heard the water, and your door was open, and I thought—" My words trailed off, fumbling for an explanation that didn't sound absurd. To my surprise, he let out a low, warm chuckle. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady and soothing. "I should have locked the door. You were just being thoughtful." His reaction disarmed me completely. I had braced myself for irritation or indignation, but instead, he reached for a towel, wrapping it around his waist with an ease that only deepened my embarrassment. The sound of the water stopped as he turned off the shower. I'll leave now," I mumbled, backing toward the door. My hands shook as I tried to process what had just happened. But before I could escape, his voice stopped me. "Wait." I turned, hesitant, to find him standing there, a faint smile on his face. "Thank you for checking on me," he said softly. "It's nice to know someone cares." Those words stayed with me long after I left his house. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a moment of neighborly concern. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted, though I couldn't yet define what it was. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding Richard, not because I was angry or upset, but because I was embarrassed. Every time I thought about that moment in his bathroom, my cheeks flushed with mortification. Yet no matter how much I tried to push it from my mind, it lingered. It wasn't just the memory of his presence, the way he'd stood there, calm and unbothered, but the kindness in his voice, the gratitude in his words. A few days later, as I was pruning the bushes in my backyard, his voice startled me. "Looks like you've got your hands full," he said, leaning casually against the fence that separated our yards. My first instinct was to stammer out an excuse and retreat, but his warm smile disarmed me, just as it had before. "It's more of a battle than a skill," I replied, attempting a light laugh. He chuckled, the sound familiar and comforting. "If you ever need help, just let me know." There was something about Richard, steady, grounding, yet unfamiliar, that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't long before I found myself spending more time in his garden, helping him revive the plants his late wife had once cared for. He worked beside me, sharing stories about his past, his wife, and the dreams he'd never had the chance to fulfill. His voice was like a comforting melody, steady and warm. At first, it was innocent, just two neighbors finding companionship in shared tasks. But as the days turned into weeks, things began to shift. The way his gaze lingered, the accidental brushes of our hands, it became impossible to ignore. As days turned into weeks, my interactions with Richard became a comforting routine. Each day, I would work in his garden for an hour or two, restoring the life and beauty it once had. What began as a simple gesture of kindness blossomed into an unspoken companionship. He would join me outside, not just as an observer, but as an eager participant. Richard had a way of sharing stories that felt like uncovering forgotten treasures. His late wife, Eleanor, became a vivid presence in those tales. He spoke of her laugh, the way she could light up a room, and the life they had built together. I would listen, captivated, wondering how such love could leave someone and yet still linger so palpably in their life. "I've kept this rose bush alive for her," he admitted one afternoon, his voice tinged with wistfulness as he knelt beside a gnarled, wilting plant. It was her favorite. Said it reminded her of the ones in her mother's garden. I didn't know what to say. The emotion in his voice was raw, unguarded. I reached out to touch the frail stem of the bush, my fingers brushing against his. The gesture was innocent, yet it lingered a second too long. We both pulled back, an awkward silence stretching between us. "It's beautiful," I said softly, breaking the quiet. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It was," he replied, almost to himself. Over time, those moments became more frequent. A fleeting touch of hands, a shared smile that held something unspoken. I found myself drawn to him in a way that felt both thrilling and unsettling. There was a gravity to Richard, a quiet strength, a kindness that felt rare in its authenticity. He saw me in a way I hadn't felt seen in years, not just as a wife or a neighbor, but as a person. One rainy afternoon, I stood in my kitchen watching the storm outside. My husband had called earlier, saying his business trip would extend another few days. I reassured him, as I always did, masking the loneliness that had become my constant companion. The house felt oppressive in its stillness. My thoughts drifted to Richard and the way his voice could fill a space with warmth. Before I realized it, I had baked a batch of cookies. It wasn't intentional, just something to pass the time. Yet as I stared at the plate of warm treats, I found myself standing at his front door. The rain had lessened to a gentle drizzle, and the faint glow of his living room lights spilled onto the porch. When Richard opened the door, his surprise quickly melted into a warm smile. "What's this?" he asked, gesturing to the plate in my hands. "Just something to share," I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious. He stepped aside, inviting me in with a graciousness that put me at ease. His home was cozy, filled with a sense of lived-in warmth. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a golden light over the room. We settled into an easy conversation, the cookies untouched between us. "I never imagined myself living alone," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the flames. Eleanor and I always thought we'd grow old together, but life had other plans. There was a vulnerability in his voice that made my chest tighten. I can't imagine how hard that must have been, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. You learn to keep going, he said simply, but there's a loneliness that never quite leaves. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would ease the pain etched into his face. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, trying to steady my nerves. The glass tipped slightly, and Richard instinctively caught it before it spilled. Our hands collided, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I'm sorry, I murmured, pulling back. Don't be, he said softly, his hand lingering just a second longer than necessary. The room seemed to shrink around us, the quiet intimacy almost too much to bear. I should have left then, made an excuse and gone back to the safety of my home. But I didn't. I stayed. The tension in the room was palpable, yet neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of Richard's gaze on me, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a fragile thread, ready to snap. I looked away, focusing on the flickering flames in the fireplace, as if they held the answers to questions I wasn't ready to ask. I should go, I said finally, my voice breaking the silence. I rose to my feet, feeling unsteady, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. Richard stood as well, his expression unreadable. I'll walk you out, he offered, though the distance between us was already too close. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain by the time we reached the door. I hesitated on the threshold, unsure of what to say. He opened his mouth, but whatever words he intended to speak were lost as his gaze met mine. Thank you for the cookies, he said finally, his voice warm but distant, as if trying to create space where there was none. I nodded, clutching my coat tightly around me. Good night, Richard. Good night, he replied, and for a moment, it felt like something more needed to be said, but neither of us dared to speak it. In the days that followed, I avoided Richard. It wasn't out of anger or regret, but a desperate attempt to rein in the feelings that had begun to take root. I busied myself with housework, with errands, anything to keep my mind from drifting to that night in his living room. Yet no matter how much I tried, he lingered in my thoughts. The warmth of his voice, the way his eyes seemed to hold an entire world of unspoken emotion. My heart ached with a longing I didn't want to admit, even to myself. When my husband finally returned from his trip, I threw myself into our routines, determined to restore a sense of normalcy. I cooked his favorite meals, asked about his meetings, laughed at his stories, even when my mind was elsewhere. But he seemed distant too, absorbed in his work, his phone, the endless demands of his career. We were two people sharing the same space, yet miles apart. One afternoon, as I pruned the hedges in the backyard, I heard Richard's voice. It startled me, the sound breaking through the silence, like a melody I hadn't realized I'd missed. He was leaning against the fence that separated our yards, his expression a mix of hesitation and something else I couldn't quite place. Looks like you've got your hands full, he said, his tone light, though his eyes held a deeper weight. I tried to summon a casual reply, but the sight of him had undone me. It's more of a battle than anything, I said, forcing a laugh. He chuckled softly, the sound so familiar it sent a pang through my chest. If you ever need help, just let me know. The offer was simple, friendly, yet it carried an unspoken meaning that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I nodded, unsure of what to say, and he lingered for a moment before retreating back to his own yard. That evening, I found myself standing at the fence, the words I'd been holding back threatening to spill out. Richard was already there, as if he'd been waiting. I've been thinking about us, he began, his voice steady, but laced with sadness. This, whatever it is, it's not fair to you. Or to him. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I know, I whispered. But I don't know how to stop feeling this way. He sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Neither do I. The honesty of his words cut through me, leaving me exposed. So, what do we do? I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, his fingers brushing against mine. We move on. We let it go. It's the right thing to do. His words should have brought relief, but instead, they deepened the ache in my chest. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes, and turned to leave. But as I walked away, I knew that moving on would be far easier said than done. The following weeks were a blur of avoidance and longing. I threw myself into rebuilding my marriage, determined to mend what I had allowed to fray. I planned date nights, cooked elaborate meals, even suggested a weekend getaway. My husband appreciated the efforts but remained distant, his mind always preoccupied. And yet, every time I saw Richard, whether it was a fleeting glance through the window or a chance encounter in the yard, my resolve faltered. The pull between us was undeniable, a force that neither of us could fully resist. One rainy evening, as I stood at my kitchen sink, I heard a knock at the door. My heart raced, knowing it could only be one person. When I opened the door, Richard stood there, soaked from the rain, his expression unreadable. I couldn't stay away, he admitted, his voice raw. I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you. The words hung in the air, both a confession and a plea. I should have told him to leave, to protect the fragile boundaries we had tried to rebuild. But instead, I stepped aside, allowing him in. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. Rain lashed against the windows as Richard stood in my living room, his presence both a comfort and a threat. Neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. I shouldn't have come, he said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost regretful, but his eyes betrayed him. They held the same longing I had felt for weeks, a pulse so strong it was impossible to ignore. Then why did you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, running a hand through his damp hair. Because I can't stop thinking about you. Every time I try, it only gets worse. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should have told him to leave, to protect the fragile boundaries we had tried so hard to maintain. But instead, I took a step closer. It started with a tentative touch. His fingers brushed against mine, hesitant yet deliberate. I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked up at him, searching his face for a sign, a reason to stop. But all I found was the same conflicted yearning that burned within me. Before I could second-guess myself, his hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear I hadn't realized was falling. You deserve more than this, he murmured. More than being alone, even when you're not. The words broke something inside me. I reached for him, and the space between us vanished. His lips met mine, tentative at first, as though giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, and with it, months of unspoken longing poured out, raw and unfiltered. The fire crackled in the background, casting a warm glow over the room, but the world outside ceased to exist. It was just us, two people lost in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. The next morning, I awoke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a moment, everything felt surreal, as though the night before had been a dream. But the warmth of Richard's body beside me was undeniable proof that it had been all too real. He stirred, his arm tightening around me as he opened his eyes. Good morning, he said, his voice soft, tinged with a mixture of contentment and uncertainty. Morning, I replied, my voice barely audible. The weight of what we had done settled over me like a heavy blanket. I should have felt guilty, and part of me did. But another part, a deeper part, felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. We need to talk, Richard said, sitting up. His expression was serious, though his touch remained gentle. I nodded, pulling the blanket around me. I know. We can't keep doing this, he said, though the words sounded more like a plea than a resolution. It's not fair to either of us. Or to him. I know, I repeated, though my heart ached at the thought of letting this go. In the days that followed, I tried to reconcile the person I thought I was with the person I had become. Every glance at my husband was a painful reminder of the betrayal I had committed, yet I couldn't bring myself to regret it entirely. What I felt with Richard was unlike anything I had ever experienced, intense, consuming, and utterly impossible to ignore. Richard and I agreed to keep our distance, but the pull between us remained. Every shared glance, every accidental touch, felt like a spark threatening to ignite a fire we couldn't control. One evening, as I sat in the living room with my husband, he looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed. "Is everything okay? You've been distant lately." His question caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, laying bare the truth, and accepting whatever consequences came. But fear held me back. Fear of losing the life we had built, even if it no longer felt complete. "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He accepted the answer without question, returning his attention to his work. But the weight of my lie lingered, a silent chasm growing between us. Despite our best efforts, Richard and I couldn't stay away from each other. Every attempt to create distance only seemed to draw us closer. We found solace in stolen moments, a lingering touch, a shared laugh, a quiet conversation that felt far too intimate. One afternoon, as we worked side by side in his garden, our hands brushed. The electricity between us was undeniable. I looked up, and his gaze met mine, filled with longing and conflict. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice raw. "Pretending that I don't feel this way about you." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Neither can I." That evening, the rain returned, soft and steady, as if the world was washing away our resolve. I found myself at Richard's door once again, unable to stay away. "I shouldn't be here," I said, though my feet refused to move. He stepped aside, his eyes never leaving mine. "But you are." Inside, the fire crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold outside. We didn't speak, the silence between us more telling than any words could be. He reached for me, and I didn't resist. This time, there was no hesitation, no pretense of restraint. We gave in completely, surrendering to the feelings we had tried so hard to suppress. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion. Guilt, longing, fear, and exhilaration battled for dominance, leaving me torn between two worlds. I loved my husband, but my connection with Richard was unlike anything I had ever known. Richard and I knew we couldn't continue down this path without consequences, but the pull between us was too strong to resist. Every moment we shared felt like borrowed time, a fleeting glimpse of a life we couldn't have. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside feeling cleaner, brighter. But inside, my heart felt heavy. Every moment I spent with Richard was both a blessing and a curse, a reminder of what I could have but couldn't truly claim. I couldn't keep living this way, straddling two lives, betraying the trust of a man who had done nothing to deserve it. Richard must have sensed my turmoil. One evening, as we sat together in the fading light, he spoke. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice steady but laced with sadness. "Not like this. It's not fair, to your husband, to you, or to me." I nodded, tears threatening to spill over. "I know, but I don't know how to stop." He reached for my hand, his touch both a comfort and a reminder of what we had become. "You have to decide what you want, Claire. Truly want. Staying in the middle will destroy us all." That night, I couldn't sleep. My husband lay beside me, his breathing slow and even, unaware of the storm raging within me. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every choice that had led me to this point. I loved my husband for his kindness, his steadiness, the life we had built together. But with Richard, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. He challenged me, understood me, made me feel seen in ways I hadn't even realized I craved. But was that enough to destroy the life I had built? Was it worth the pain it would cause, not just to my husband, but to myself, to Richard, to everyone entangled in this web of deceit? The next day, I met Richard in the garden where we had shared so many moments. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fall. He looked up from his work, his eyes softening when he saw me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He set down his tools and straightened, his expression unreadable. I had a feeling this was coming. "I can't do this anymore," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Not because I don't care about you, because I do, more than I should. But I can't keep lying to myself or to him. And I can't ask you to wait for something I may never be able to give." Richard's jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. "I understand. I've always known this might be how it ends." I stepped closer, placing a hand on his chest. "I'll never regret what we shared, but I need to figure out who I am without breaking everything in my life. And that means letting you go." He pulled me into an embrace, holding me as if trying to memorize the feel of me one last time. "I want you to be happy, Claire, even if it's not with me." The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I confessed everything to my husband, unable to live with the weight of my deceit. The look in his eyes when I told him broke something inside me. But instead of anger, he surprised me with sadness. "Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost fragile. "I didn't even realize it myself," I said honestly. "I thought I was fine until I wasn't." He nodded, absorbing my words. "Do you want to stay and try to fix this? Or are you already gone?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I owe it to you, and to myself, to try." Rebuilding our marriage wasn't easy. It required painful honesty, counseling, and countless conversations that laid bare every fear, every insecurity, every unspoken truth. There were moments I wanted to run, moments he did too. But slowly, we began to find each other again, not as we had been, but as we were now. As for Richard, he left town shortly after our goodbye, choosing to start fresh in a place where memories of me wouldn't haunt him. He left a letter in my mailbox before he went, a simple note that brought both tears and a sense of closure. "Claire, I'll always cherish the moments we shared, even if they weren't meant to last. You taught me how to feel again, how to hope, and for that I'll always be grateful. I hope you find what you're looking for. Be happy. Richard." Time softened the edges of the pain. My husband and I found new ways to connect, to rediscover the love that had once been the foundation of our lives. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real, and it was ours. And as for me, I learned that love isn't always about choosing the easiest path or the most exciting one. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay, to fight, to face the parts of yourself you'd rather avoid. It's about learning to balance desire with commitment, passion with loyalty, and dreams with reality. In the end, the choices I made weren't about what was right or wrong, but about who I wanted to be. And though the journey wasn't easy, it was one I'd never regret. The rain returned that evening as I stood by the window, watching the droplets trace patterns on the glass. The world felt different now, not perfect, but more honest. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace.